Let me start by introducing who we are. Central London Humanists is the humanist group for anyone who lives, works, or finds themselves in Central London. We are a group run by volunteers, and you can say of us that we are a group of free thinkers. We try to provide a safe space for non-religious people to support each other and work together for the causes that we believe in. What we have in common is that we believe that we can live ethical and fulfilling lives without superstitions or a belief in the supernatural. And we also believe that this is the only life that we have and that we must make the most out of it. We also firmly believe that we must treat other humans and living beings with compassion. And as an organization, we champion human rights and the rights of non-religious people. We meet several times a month for a variety of activities, such as pub socials, speaker events like this one. We have a book club, we have debates. From time to time, we have also museums and theater trips, picnics and walks, and campaigning events. Many people come to our events, whether you call yourself a humanist or not, you consider yourself an atheist, agnostic, or non-religious, or perhaps you're questioning your beliefs, you're all welcome. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Steven Di Costa. His pronouns are he, him. He's a researcher in cognitive neuroscience. After a varied undergraduate career in film studies, Japanese language, and psychology, he completed a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. His doctoral thesis investigated the human sense of agency during voluntary movement, and his postdoctoral work is focused on the perception of temperature and pain. Please welcome Dr. Steven Di Costa.
Thank you for that introduction. And I guess we'll get right to it. So just let me share the screen. This is what we want. And here we go. So hopefully you can see a page that says predictions. JC, is that working?
Yes, we can see that. That's correct.
Terrific. And you can hear me as well.
We can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Okay, so as JC mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, and so this talk is necessarily going to involve some discussion about brains. So let's start with just a few quick fun facts about the brain. It's a little larger than two clenched fists. So if you get sort of your two fists and put them together like that, have a look at it. That's roughly the size of your brain. It's sort of a little smaller than some people expect, but kind of depends on the size of your hands, I guess. The consistency surprises people. The brain is actually not terribly solid. It's sort of barely solid, a bit like tofu or Greek yogurt or a sort of a jelly type thing. So if you put one on a plate, it will sort of happily sit there for a while, but over time it will sort of gradually kind of fall apart. Unless it's fixed in something, obviously. And there is now a brain emoji, which is very exciting for all of us neuroscientists. That was quite a victory. I think you know that your field is made it when you have your own emoji. So brains are very interesting, but why do we have them? Because, as you probably have noticed, not all organisms do have brains. There are some very successful organisms out there, like trees and grasses, that don't have brains. They don't have a centralized nervous system at all. So what are brains for? And Daniel Wolpert gave an excellent TED talk on this, which I encourage you to look up at some point. But his sort of claim is that we have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that is to produce adaptable and complex movements. And he cites as part of the convincing evidence a delightful creature called the sea squirt, which begins its life as a sort of tadpole type thing at the bottom of the ocean. And it moves around, following currents and attempting to find a place on which to perch. Once the little sea squirt has perched on a rock or the bottom of the sea or wherever it's going to spend the rest of its life, and it is anchored in place, the first thing it does is dissolve its brain and eats it. to sort of recuperate some of the energy. So as soon as it's fixed in one place, the sea squirt has decided it no longer needs a brain as such, and it will just respond to, stimuli in the environment. But organisms like humans and dogs and cats and flies and all sorts of things, we do very complex movements. We have gestures, we move around the place, we locomote. And those are complex because they are not simply immediate responses to something that is happening to us. So plants are still very good at moving, but it's usually in response to the appearance of light that it will turn towards, or even in the most dynamic cases, if a fly lands on a part of a Venus flytrap, the Venus flytrap will respond by closing. But that's really about as complex as it gets. Whereas if you look at humans and dogs and cats, etc., the movements that we do require timing and interception and rhythm for things like walking, and adjustment as we go along. So they're really quite complex, and they basically require a centralized control system that can draw in information from many different places in order to make these complex movements possible. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, have a look sort of at this diagram and consider what happens when you, for example, reach forward to grab a cup of water or something like that. So just imagine looking at this top-down view here, all of the different movements that have to work in concert to make that possible. So your brain needs to tell your shoulders which angle to be at, it needs to tell your upper arm where to go, then it needs to tell your lower arm where to go, and finally it needs to direct the hand and the fingers so that it can grab the glass. That's not a trivial problem, because if you think about, for example, what the forearm is doing, it's not doing the entire movement from down by your side all the way to the glass. What it's doing is just that small bit of movement that is necessary once the upper arm has already moved it into place. And then once the lower arm is in place, then the hand is able to do what it's doing. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on all at once. The brain is having to keep control of, all of these angles at the same time that it's controlling how much breath you're taking in and keeping your body upright and all these sorts of things. So even very, very simple movements are complex and require, a lot of calculations on the part of the brain. Now, if we think about something even more complex that involves an external object, think about catching a ball, or if you're a tennis player, intercepting a ball. And you'll see that in addition to making sure that your hand with the racket ends up where it needs to be, you're also trying to predict where that ball is going to land so that you can intercept it possibly. So here we are, we've already mentioned prediction, and we're only on slide 5. So if you have a look at the tennis players down here, you can see what is probably some very high level prediction going on, and the little heat map that's been superimposed on the tennis court there is, gives you an idea of what a pro tennis player has inside their brain in terms of understanding where the likely places that the ball is going to be. So prediction is very, very fundamental to simple movements and to interacting with the world around us. And that's a very, very important point, because if you have a look around you right now, with the possible exception of things that you might see out the window, just about everything that you can see is a product of humans interacting with the world around us. Pretty much everything around us is as a result of us making actions, doing movements in order to create some sort of external effect and change the way things are around us. And as that behavior becomes more and more complex, we end up doing more and more crazy things, and we end up conjuring up sort of increasingly bizarre predictions. And we'll get onto that sort of a bit later on in the talk. So I'm going to sort of cover 3 main areas. We're going to look at how the brain makes predictions, the nuts and bolts, if you like. We're going to have a look at what predictions we sort of do in our daily lives, some things that sort of seem very obvious and some that we kind of take for granted. And then finally, we're going to look at what happens when we start to talk about prediction, so it's kind of the meta topic, is when we become aware that we're making predictions and we discuss it with each other, when we reflect on our own decisions, what sort of behavior does that lead to? And of course, what we'll see is that we entrust other people with predictions, and we, monitor predictions on other people and decide how we feel about those and whether we find them convincing or not, because ultimately predictions are the currency of persuasion. So that's very important. So in terms of the nuts and bolts, I'm not going to do anything too detailed and crazy because we don't have that much time. But here's our friend, the brain again. And if we take a very sort of simple example of some kind of intuitive prediction that we think about. So when we think about something like looking at the clouds out the window and predicting that it's going to rain, so you decide to take your umbrella, or you're choosing which university to attend because you predict which one is going to give you the best chance at a good career, that sort of very high level forward planning happens kind of here in the front of the brain, just kind of above and behind the eyes. And the interesting thing about that is that it's a part of the brain which develops quite late in life. So it's probably no surprise that we don't really get good at forward planning and thinking too much about the future until we've grown quite a bit. And it's usually sort of late adolescence that really starts to take shape. Pointing at individual places in the brain to sort of describe behavior can be useful for some things. Very low level processes like vision and auditory processing, that sort of thing. But for something like prediction, it's not terribly helpful to sort of point at bits and say this does this and this does that, as appealing as that might be. So what we're really going to talk about is the process that happens, more than worrying too much about where exactly it's happening, because the truth is brains are very complex and lots of things happen in lots of different places at the same time. Now, there are two very, very sort of influential concepts about how we make predictions and what happens when they don't work out. The first one is the concept of a forward model. And that's basically the idea that any good action requires a good plan. So let's take a simple movement as an example. Imagine touching your nose, or even feel free to actually touch your nose right now if you like. And what happens in the brain, probably unsurprisingly, is that a motor command gets issued by the motor cortex part of the brain, which is sort of right up, sort of on the crown. And that sends a message through neurons, the brain's messengers, into the motor system wherever is relevant, and tells the relevant muscles how to move in order to get into the new state that you want to be in. Okay, so the old state was my arm is down by my side. The new state is my nose is up, my hand is up by my nose. Now, when you do that movement, there are going to be some external influences, things like wind and things like the amount of coffee that you've had and things like the amount of attention that you're paying. These are all sort of things, factors, influences that are going to have some sort of effect on where exactly your nose ends up, how accurate you can be, and what it's going to feel like when you get there. So because there's a little bit of noise in the environment, the brain does something very clever, which is to, at the same time that it sends the command to the muscles, it keeps in the brain a forward model of what's about to happen. It basically makes a copy of the plan, which it sends to other parts of the brain, and it says, this is what I'm planning to do. And the brain says, okay, well, if that's what you're planning to do, and it kind of runs through a little simulation and says, if that's what you're planning to do, then this is the outcome we expect. So before it's even happened, your brain has said, right, you're going to move your upper arm, your lower arm, your hand, and your finger. And when you get there, after about 200 milliseconds, you're going to feel pressure on your fingertip. You're going to feel pressure on your nose. You're going to feel an amount of warmth on the end of your finger, and you're going to feel the same thing on your nose. And that will be how you know that you've successfully made the movement. That's the prediction of the brain, if you like. And then once the movement is completed, your sensory apparatus, so all of the nerves and things in your nose and in your hand, will send a report back to the brain. So part of the brain has said, this is what I expect. And then all of your sensory apparatus says, this is what's actually happened. And for most of us, most of the time, those two things are, fairly comparable. But what the brain does is it takes the two of them and it says, okay, where were things different? So the forward model predicted that you'd get there after 200 milliseconds, but actually you got there after 250 milliseconds. So next time you need to move that muscle a little bit faster to get there in the time that you expect. And actually there was a little less pressure than you were expecting when your finger got there. So maybe you weren't actually as close to your nose as you think you are. And then it uses this information to improve your actions in the future. Okay, so the basic idea is you do something at the same time that you're doing it, your brain predicts what is going to happen. And then once it gets the report back from the real world, it says, okay, well, we need to make these adjustments in the future. And it's doing that all the time, constantly. Every time you move, every time you take in a breath, every time you adjust your posture, every time you think about sort of getting up and going to get a cup of coffee, your brain is making predictions about what it expects to happen so that when it does happen, it can monitor how accurately it's doing. Obviously, children tend to be very bad at this. If you watch a child walking, you can see that their forward model is not very accurate at all. And then over time, with feedback, it learns to make better predictions and put its foot in the right place with the right amount of pressure, with its body at the right angle and that sort of thing. And eventually it stands up and it walks around and has a good time. Unfortunately, in teenage years, the brain starts to change considerably through all the growth that's happening. And teenagers have a really hard time because what they have established as a fairly reliable predictor suddenly becomes very bad at making predictions because their arms are suddenly too long and they're suddenly too tall and their brain is working too fast and all sorts of things. So the predictions aren't as good. They become clumsy and they start taking risks because their frontal areas are not too well developed and all sorts of things. If you are interested in what happens in teenage brains, I can recommend to you this excellent book by Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, which talks all about the teenage brain and all of the very exciting things that happen at that very critical time of life. So I'll let you discover that if that's something that's of interest to you. Okay, the next sort of and final stop on the brain tour here is the concept of a prediction error. And I live in a very, very tall building, which has lots of apartments that all look exactly the same. And the other day I came home and without realizing it, I got off on the wrong floor and marched straight towards the apartment door that looks exactly like my apartment door and proceeded to walk into an apartment that was not my own because it was unlocked. And obviously, as soon as I walked in, my brain sent off an alert signal because it needed me to know that I was in the wrong place and I needed to adjust my behavior by leaving the other person's apartment. So what we're talking about here is something a little bit different to that forward model comparison, because we're not talking about a difference of quality. It's not just that I'd moved too fast or too slow or too high or too low, but I'd actually gotten the complete wrong outcome to what I was expecting. And this is something that we call a prediction error. And the brain is very, very good at letting you know when something that you have predicted has gone completely wrong. Fortunately, it's very easy to study in a lab. We use things like an oddball experiment where we sort of show a repetitive image like a green dot and a green dot and a green dot, and then we show something different like a pink dot, and we can look at what happens at that time in the brain to see what's going on when our brain perceives something that is unexpected given the experience that it has just had. Similarly, we can pair images together, which is a slightly more sophisticated approach. So we can show a dog and a cat, and then a dog and a cat, and then a dog and a cat, and then a dog and a duck. The duck, of course, is the prediction error because your brain by then has gotten used to the fact that after you see a dog, you're going to see a cat. So in the brain, what happens is I've pulled these results from a study by Meyer and Olson in 2011. And this is the dog and the cat example, basically. So image A is the dog, and you get a certain response in the brain when you see the dog, because previously you saw nothing. So there's been a change in the environment, and the brain signals that. Now, what they did for image B is they looked at the brain activity both when the next picture was the predicted outcome, i.e. the cat, which you always seem to get, or when it's the unpredicted outcome, i.e. the duck, which you weren't expecting to see. And as you can see, the unpredicted image, the duck, is significantly higher than the predicted image, which is the cat. And this happens in a very, very short space of time. So if you have a look down at the x-axis there, you'll see that that peak in the brain happens at 100 milliseconds. And that is a long time before all sorts of other brain activity that we're conscious of is happening. So before you've even realized it, your brain has sent an alert into all of the relevant parts of information processing, just to let it know that the thing you were expecting didn't happen. Okay, so prediction errors are a very, very fundamental part of how the brain works with predictions. We make predictions so that we can refine our behavior and get better at doing things, learning. But we also have this prediction error apparatus so that when things go completely wrong, we can learn from that, and it becomes a salient stimuli which causes the brain to respond in a certain way to adjust itself again, so that we can adapt better to the environment, so that we can learn better about the world around us, so that we can learn, for example, that sometimes ducks pop up when we're expecting cats. And that is the basic setup. That's really how the brain kind of manages the business of prediction. And what I really want to stress there is that it is something which is happening constantly, from very, very small things that we barely think about, like breathing, up to very, very complex kinds of thought. I'll just show you one last set of results here, which I thought was a very clever follow-up to the sorts of experiments with the dog and cat, which used music. And it said, well, okay, maybe what's going on here is that this is not so much a prediction error signal, it's just a change signal. It just signals that something is different, not necessarily contrary to what we expected. And so in this study by Todorovic et al., what they did was played a series of musical tones in an ascending sequence, so that each tone that followed was not a repetition of the one before, like the dog and the cat and the dog and the cat and the green dot and the green dot and the green dot. It was different. It was ascending by a tone each time. So it was predictable, but it wasn't repeated. And then what you have is that the brain provides the strongest signal, not when there's a change, but when there is an unexpected repetition. So if after 3 ascending notes, the next note doesn't ascend but stays the same, you get a repetition of the note, then actually the brain says, oh, there's your problem. And so that experiment was quite good at teasing out the fact that this signal that we see is not just the brain saying something is different, but that the brain is saying there is something that went against what you were expecting. Okay? So moving on then, we can see that, there we go. In our daily lives, we make predictions at all sorts of levels. Automatic, which are sort of reflexes, habitual actions, and sort of survival behavior like breathing. Semi-automatic, things we don't generally think about, but that we're aware of and that we attend to sometimes. Things like sort of being aware of crowds and managing how to move around in groups. And agentic predictions, which are things that we actually really consciously think about and predict and reflect on. And to sort of provide an illustration, let's have a look at this image. And let's have a sip of water. So there's a lot going on here. And if you imagine that you are walking through this scene on your way to an appointment, your brain is doing a lot of predicting. What sort of things are going on? Let's start with the automatic stuff. Oops, there we go. So your brain is making some very, very low level predictions, like I need to intake 500 milliliters of air when I inhale, and my feet are going to hit the ground with 70 kilopascals of pressure. These are the sorts of predictions that it makes just to kind of keep the body working and moving. And every time it does that, it will get, through the forward model, a sense of whether or not it's predicting well or not. So if you're slightly exhausted, when you predict that you might need 500 milliliters of air on inhalation, your forward model will tell you, oh, actually, no, you need a little bit more than that because you're tired. And so you slowly make adjustments so that you can move through the world. At the same time, there's these kind of middle level predictions that are going on all the time. So you predict, right, this lady in front of me is going to continue walking slowly because she has been for the last 2 minutes. That seems very likely. This chap here is going to block the way if I try and go around to the left because he's pointed in that direction. And when our brain makes predictions, it relies on that kind of previous trajectory information. This guy on the left is probably not going to see me because he's distracted. That's a prediction I've made by looking at his, his eyes and his face. So I might go around to the right. This guy in the backpack will probably continue walking nice and fast because he has been previously. And the guy in the truck, I know from sort of previous experience with people digging around in vans, is that they are probably about to emerge. So I don't really want to get too close to him because he might, sort of pull something out and get in my way. And those are the kind of middle level predictions that you aren't sort of consciously processing in your head, but you're sort of dimly aware of them and your brain is doing them all the time. And then you might get prediction errors when somebody, does a quick U-turn or when the lady starts sort of suddenly walking faster, and you adjust as you need to. At the same time, you're making some high level predictions as well, like this busy street is going to make me late. And I probably don't have time to sort of stop and have lunch before my appointment, so I can probably get something to eat at the end of this street based on what kind of street it looks like. And if I go left, I think that will put me closer to the station so I can get to where I'm going faster. These are things that we sort of almost speak to ourselves in our head. And on occasion, I know I certainly do, actually say them out loud, even when we're on our own. So there's a kind of broad spectrum of, to sort of illustrate the different levels of prediction that we're doing, and just to sort of give you a sense of just how many predictions are going on at all times in the brain using those mechanisms that I showed you earlier. Fear. Now, fear is a very interesting and useful system that the brain has developed by using its prediction system. Fear can arise through alarm when something that we don't expect occurs, and it can arrive through suspense when we are expecting something, but it is being withheld from us and we don't get to sort of see the resolution. Alarms are very useful for avoiding threats, but for something to be unexpected, you have to have an expectation. So fear relies on the prediction system in order to say, right, you are expecting that the world is going to be peaceful and calm, but actually this thing is happening, and so you therefore need to pay attention. Without the prediction system, for example, if you are a tree, then things like car crashes don't really mean much to you. When a car crashes, you see dogs and cats raise their head, you see people turn and look, but trees don't ever seem terribly fussed about it because they don't have a prediction system. They don't know what to expect. So this sudden change in the atmosphere means nothing to them. Our fear and our alarm system is usually very well calibrated. That's not always the case, as we can see in this. So I don't know how well everybody saw that video, but there was a lady with sort of a glass of juice, the toast pops up, and she makes an incredible scream because her alarm system is not well calibrated to the situation. Fortunately for most of us, we're a little bit more calibrated than that, and we have a better sense of which sudden things to expect in our environment based on our previous experience. So as I mentioned, suspense is what happens when we are making predictions, but they are not being resolved. So we are constantly sort of awaiting something to happen, and we have a sense of what it might be, but we don't get that resolution. And music is very good at playing on this, and roller coasters are also very good at playing on this, because in a roller coaster, for example, you are making predictions constantly, but your brain is not very good at it because we aren't used to going that fast, and we're not used to moving in all sorts of directions, even when we are going that fast. And so our prediction system is completely at a loss, and the whole thing is very, very alarming and suspenseful for the body. So roller coasters are very, very good at manipulating our prediction system to create a very, very strong effect. Fear is a very, very interesting sort of neurological phenomenon, because the brain needs some way to create positive associations when outcomes are non-threatening. So if every time we heard a sudden noise or got a prediction error about some other thing, we perceived it as aversive and unpleasant, then we wouldn't really be having a very, very good time. What the brain needs to do is say, oh, okay, that was unexpected, and it was good that you paid attention to it, but actually it wasn't that bad, and it's probably good that you learned that. And what happens is we get this wonderful social and psychological, neurological phenomenon called humor, whereby fear is almost turned on its head, and our brain says, oh my gosh, that was something that I really didn't expect, but it didn't kill us, and that's terrific. So here, have some endorphins and enjoy the experience. And we laugh. So fear and humor are sort of very, very tightly connected, as this man is very, very aware of.
You see, it all starts with a baby, we'll say at the age of 6 months, and the mother says, boo, and scares the hell out of the baby, gives it the hiccups, and then the baby giggles. There's its first moment of fear. Later on, it's on a swing, getting higher and higher, and catching its breath when it goes too high. And so it goes. We all enjoy, shall we say, putting our toe in the cold water of fear. You see it all?
We do indeed. So we then move on to thinking about predictions. And so this is that really sort of high level where we discuss predictions and we talk about who is good and bad at making them. And these are the predictions that we actually talk about and discuss and evaluate. And some people like Nate Silver earn their ability to write a book and sell many copies by making predictions about things like presidential elections and being right about them. And we say, oh, okay, this person knows something about how to predict this sort of thing. I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to listen to what he has to say and give him money for his book. Other people earn their predictive nous in different ways and make different claims about where their information is coming from, reverting sometimes to sort of supernatural explanations about how it is they know what they know. But in both cases, these are people whose business is predicting, if you like. And there have always been predictors, and there have always been predictors who engineer accuracy in order to convince you that they are better predictors than other people. And some early predictors used, objects like bones that they would throw on the ground, and they would tell you what the bones are telling them, and they would make predictions about who was going to live and die and when harvests were going to be good and bad and that sort of thing. Now, what made a good predictor wasn't necessarily that they were accurate in pure terms, but that they sort of had a sense of what was going to happen, and so they could make sort of risky predictions that would come true. And they often had knowledge that was gleaned from years of experience. Often these early predictors were elders who had been around for a long time and thus seen a lot of things. or people that had just good intuitions and noticed good at spotting patterns and things. So people that throw bones on the floor, for example, might have noticed over time that the bone is much more likely to land, this side up. And so if it wants to make, a pleasant prediction that people are going to like, it will attach sort of meaning to this, part of the bone and say, oh, well, the bone popped up this way, so this good thing will happen to you. And people like to hear good predictions. So they would, sort of feel that they can trust that predictor because, they say good things. These are called Barnum statements. Have a read of those. You might find that these are things that that you feel, are quite representative of your personality, you in particular. And the reason is that they are designed to apply to just about everybody. So these are the sorts of things that you read in, horoscopes and personality assessments that are not grounded in, science and things like that. And, really, if you look at sort of statement number 7, for example, at times you're extroverted, affable, sociable, at other times you are introverted. Well, of course, that's everybody. I mean, nobody is one thing all the time. So it's actually not saying very much. And yet people read it and they say, oh, that's actually very true. That does represent me. Of course, it does represent everybody. But, you can present statements like this to people and convince them that you are an accurate predictor, even if what you are doing is not so much being 100% purely accurate, but engineering accuracy, either by knowing the material that you work with or constructing it in a certain way that gives you the advantage. Now I have the word usefulness here, and it's very important because I think that trade-off between accuracy and usefulness explains a lot about why people turn to certain predictors rather than others. And it's really important to remember that accuracy is not the only currency that predictions deal in. Minimizing uncertainty and things like that is actually very useful to a lot of people. Our brain, as we've discovered, responds to alarming noises because we are afraid of being eaten by lions, and we're afraid of having, rocks fall on our head and things like that. So when we hear a loud noise and we become afraid, it's actually not an accurate prediction that there's a lion coming to eat me or that there's a rock that's going to fall on my head. But it's a very useful prediction to have because on the odd occasion that it is a rock falling on my head, I'm going to be prepared. And if the payoff for that is that I make, very, very many predictions with false positive, then what we've, discovered through evolution is that that's actually okay. That it's useful to have that predictive system, even if it's not 100% accurate all the time. People will like it and people will buy it. I'm just going to skip the next Simpsons video because we don't have as much time as we thought we did. I can point you in the direction of classic Simpsons stuff if you like. But let's quickly look at the church as a predictor. And I'm sort of focusing on the Christian church just because I think it's one that most of us are sort of generally familiar with, particularly sort of in the UK. And the church makes some pretty bold predictions to people, and people find those predictions useful or at least appealing. It makes predictions about safety and security and wish fulfillment through prayer. It makes predictions about what is going to happen after you die. Now, the thing about these predictions is that they are, of course, objectively unverifiable. There is no way of saying, oh, well, this happened because of prayer, or, oh, this prediction about what happens when we die and move on, is shown to be true or false. They're things that we can't verify, but they are to a lot of people who are afraid of dying and who, need safety and security, and who are looking for ways, that they can influence the world, more than they currently do. They hope that they can achieve that through membership of this group, and through prayer, and through, appealing to, these sort of spiritual beings. And there's a long history of spiritual beings going all the way back, and prediction is really at the heart of what they sell to the people. Whether you're talking about very early religions, which had sort of totemic and animalistic spiritual, deities and things, it was all about, okay, well, if we make sacrifices and if we worship this person, then we are more likely to have a good crop, and we are less likely to have aversive weather and things like that. And of course, most years the crop is fine, and most years the weather is okay. So generally speaking, your prediction that these sacrifices will lead to these things is actually going to turn out. And on the odd occasion that it doesn't, there's always somebody, that can provide an explanation for why that is, because you didn't have enough faith when you made the sacrifice, or because you didn't, pray during the right phase of the moon or whatever. And the reason the church making these grand predictions, just to return, sorry, to the Christian church, they've been very successful because of partly because of survivorship bias. So the Christian church, quite luckily, was growing at roughly the time that the Roman pantheons were going out, and the Roman civilization sort of was in decline, and so the church was able to sort of make a prediction of being a protected group of people, because look how well they were doing while everything was crumbling around them. A sort of type of engineered accuracy, if you like. And by appealing to people through fear and through things, sort of psychological tricks, if you like Pascal's wager, which says, we don't know whether, this Christian idea about heaven and hell is accurate, but hell is just about the worst thing we can possibly imagine. So even if you're unsure, you should probably just go with the safe bet and believe in Christianity, just in case. And it's a facile argument, because there are other religions out there that have their own versions of hell, and who's to say that, by subscribing to Christianity, we're not, securing our place in their versions of hell. There's lots of reasons why Pascal's wager doesn't work. But it's a trick of prediction. It relies on you predicting this awful outcome, and it relies on a prediction that if you belong to the church, that will not happen. And as I say, they're objectively unverifiable predictions, but people find them extremely useful. And the effects are real. That is very, very important. So here is the brain of, or rather sort of collected images of the brain of a Mormon who is having their brain scanned while they are engaged in various activities that, to use sort of the phrase, lead to feeling the spirit. And these are things like reading scripture and seeing audiovisual presentations and reciting sort of well-known prayers and hymns and those sorts of things. And what we can see sort of right down the bottom here is that you have this like peak in activity in brain regions that are sort of highlighted in rows B, C, and D here, right about the time that those things are presented. So around the time that, the hymns and the audiovisual stuff is presented, around the time that the person rates their feeling of the spirit to be particularly high, that's when you have these peaks. And the sections that are in the blue bars are the sections that are significantly higher than average. So there is a response in the brain, and we see it, particularly down in rows, C and D, matching up with areas that you see in row A, which are places in the brain that fire reward signals and make us feel good. Okay, so could this Mormon in the scanner be getting, this sort of experience from something else, from belonging to a community group that's non-religious? Possibly, maybe. But the fact is, they do get it from this. And the prediction that their church has made, that if they belong to the church and if they pray and if they say these hymns, that they are going to feel good, is in this sense working out for them. And so there's every reason to, for them to continue trusting their church as a good predictor. We're often inclined to look back at successful predictors in history and think poorly of those that don't believe them. But it's important to remember that some of these effects are real, and that there is a sense of usefulness in even inaccurate predictions. let's take this famous example, Copernicus. So the church was quite insistent that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Copernicus was quite sure that the sun was at the center of the universe, and both agreed that there were these sort of circular orbits happening around whatever happened to be in the middle. Now, of these two explanations, one of them, from Copernicus, was deeply unpopular and made everybody feel deeply uncomfortable because it contradicted everything that they sort of thought up until that point. And critically, it was against the church that they were all very fond of. What is often forgotten about this situation when we look back at it and we go, oh, the church, they were so silly, they didn't believe Copernicus when he was obviously right, is that both of these models, this geocentric and this heliocentric model, as presented by Copernicus at the time, make exactly the same predictions about what you are going to see in the sky. The model that Copernicus put out there was not a better predictor of what you would see when you looked up than the geocentric model that was put out by the church. The change didn't happen until Kepler, many, many years later, proposed the concept of elliptical orbits and said, okay, I have this model that's actually going to make some different predictions than your geocentric model. And I'm going to really convince you that I'm right by making an extremely high risk prediction. And he said the planet Venus is going to appear in the sky at this precise time. And that is a huge risky prediction to make because the sky is a big place and there are lots of times that he could have proposed. But he said it's going to be right there and it's going to be at this exact time. And his chances of being wrong, all things being equal, was astronomical. And yet Venus appeared in the sky exactly where he said. And so he was able to make a very, very convincing case for his model. Up until that point, it's really important to remember that the model of the universe that we've all come to know and love wasn't actually making any better predictions. So there wasn't a lot of impetus for your average person who was going along perfectly happily and feeling very secure by belonging to this group of people, the church that kind of looked after them. There wasn't really any good reason for them to change their mind in that sense. Accuracy on this occasion, Copernicus's model had enjoyed the privilege of being correct, but that didn't have a lot of usefulness to anybody. But what does happen is that these grand claims, such as whatever you ask in my name, I will do, over time, people start to realize that those predictions are not coming true. These promises, which are a kind of prediction, they lose reliability. So no matter how comforting they are, eventually there comes a time when people say, okay, well, it just seems like a lot of the predictions you're making aren't coming true. And the really big predictions you're making, we actually have no way of sort of verifying them. And that's when people start to turn away from the church, and that's when the gods die off. And we start to think about systems that prioritize accuracy at potentially the cost of usefulness and definitely at the cost of glamour, such as science. And science operates by prioritizing accuracy, by making many small predictions. And science is often usually in the business of aiming to be wrong so that we can learn something. We say, this is what I predict, and I'm going to run this experiment, which is perfectly designed to prove me wrong. And so if the experiment works out, then that's terrific. But actually, if the experiment doesn't work out and my hypothesis is wrong, then we've learned something and we can make better predictions in the future. And so just like the little alien guy here, we do numerous diagrams and we explain how wrong we are all of the time. And that's terrific. And we learn from it and we make better predictions. And it's a different type of prediction because it's a prediction that is aimed at sort of long-term benefit to a wide range of people rather than just me feeling good about myself and not being afraid of dying right now. We're nearly at the end of the talk, I promise. I've gone over time, I'm quite sure. But the last sort of point is to think about what happens when, the value of usefulness over accuracy collides with the value of accuracy over usefulness. What happens during that conflict? This is what happens. So these two gentlemen on the screen right now make absolutely horrendously inaccurate predictions, both about whether or not they can build a wall that Mexico is going to pay for, or whether or not the British economy is going to be better following, an extremely violent act of self-destruction. Emphasis on economically, that's sort of the point. Why do people sort of love these gentlemen and follow them and do whatever they say and vote for them and put them in positions of power? Because although their predictions are inaccurate, demonstrably, verifiably, their predictions are useful to a lot of people. They are appealing because people are afraid of the changing world. They're afraid of changing demographics in the country that they live. They're afraid that their country is not as strong and powerful as it used to be. And therefore, the predictions that they're making about the future terrify them. And they're afraid of that, and they want somebody to fix that. So even if these people are, sort of, as I say, demonstrously bad predictors, they are making very comforting predictions that are very, very appealing. And so if you are a person who is not immediately threatened by the economy tanking, or whatever other things are going down, then you might actually see much more value in following the predictions made by these people than by the sort of drier predictions made by economists that tell you, oh no, actually, it's going to be terrible. So what we then have is this sort of question: what do we do with this information? What use can we make of everything we've learned about predictions? And I suggest three things: be understanding, be compassionate, and be protected. So understanding, fortunately, you've just had me speak at you for an hour about how predictions work. So now you know a bit more about it. Consider things like confirmation bias and engineered accuracy and people's fear of change, and understand how that works with the prediction system. Remember that predictions are not something that just happen by specific people at specific times that get talked about. Predictions are in our bones, the way that our bodies work and move and operate, and that we're doing them all the time. And if you want to persuade people, you need to work with their prediction system. Be compassionate, see the usefulness in predictions that are not entirely accurate. It's very common to see people arguing about the same point, where one person is just attempting to shine a light on how inaccurate this other person's predictions are. And the response is, okay, but I like what they're saying and I believe in them. And there's no way that we can say that for certain and all sorts of other things. There's just a lack of value on accuracy on one side and arguably a lack of value of usefulness on the other. Be protected, know all about the tricks that people use, know about engineered accuracy, know about Barnum statements and things like that, so that when you feel like somebody is making excellent predictions, you can sort of analyze that and say, okay, but are they really? Is this not something I could have predicted myself? And finally, force predictions to perform. I often, when confronted with religious people who are trying to convince me of their worldview, or in any sort of similar situations, COVID has provided plenty of examples for this, force people's predictions to work. Somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, don't get into arguments, just win bets. If you are confident that what you believe and what you predict is accurate, you should be happy to sort of put your money on the table and say, okay, well, let's see what happens. But you can use that to flip the script on people. So when people come at you and say, okay, well, I think this is how the universe works, and therefore I think you should change your behavior this way, the response can often be, okay, I don't find your description of the universe to be that convincing. Don't try and sort of disprove the existence of God, because that's a fool's errand. Don't try and tell people, oh, okay, what you believe is inaccurate for these reasons, because they'll just find, other ways to get around it. What you want to say is, okay, I've heard everything you've said, and I just don't find it convincing. You are going to have to work harder to convince me. You are going to have to make better predictions than this system that I currently have, and force their predictions, to perform. And that has the benefit of, firstly, making them do all of the work. And secondly, it has the benefit of keeping you open-minded, because if they do a good job of convincing you, then maybe you might realize that actually you were wrong. And it's always good for us to sort of remember that we can always be wrong, and that the predictions that we're making might not always be entirely accurate, and they might not always have accuracy as their intended outcome. And that has pretty much brought us to the end of everything I wanted to say. So I'm going to firstly apologize to JC for taking so much extra time, but here we are.
You're fine, you're fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Di Costa, for this fascinating talk. Please, let's give him a massive round of digital applause. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all at any of our future events, and bye for now.